Imagine walking into a courtroom expecting nothing more than to tell the truth, only to realize within seconds that the room has already decided who you are. The courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, had the familiar smell of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place where lives could quietly change with a single swing of a judge's gavel. It was just after 9 in the morning, sunlight spilling through tall windows and stretching across the floor in long pale stripes. Lawyers shuffled through folders. A bailiff leaned near the wall with his arms crossed, and a few spectators whispered to each other while waiting for the hearing to begin. In the middle of that quiet routine, a tall man stepped through the courtroom doors. His name was Marcus Hale. He wore a simple charcoal gray suit, the kind that didn't try to impress anyone but still fit with quiet precision. His posture was steady, shoulders squared, his movements calm in a way that made people glance twice without knowing exactly why. Marcus carried a slim folder in one hand, the documents inside neatly arranged. He wasn't there for attention. He wasn't there to argue a case. He was there because someone had asked him to speak as a witness. To most people in that room, he looked like just another man arriving for court. But to Officer Daniel Briggs, the uniformed officer standing near the aisle, Marcus looked like something else entirely. Briggs had spent 17 years wearing his badge, and over time that badge had begun to feel less like responsibility and more like ownership. He noticed Marcus the moment he walked in. His eyes narrowed, his expression tightening with a kind of casual suspicion that had become second nature to him. Marcus paused near the back row of benches, scanning the courtroom quietly, trying to locate the attorney who had requested his presence. The room was calm, predictable, almost dull. That calm lasted exactly 3 seconds. Officer Briggs stepped forward with quick, heavy footsteps that echoed against the courtroom floor. Without asking a single question, without offering any explanation, he moved into Marcus's path and delivered a sudden, forceful push with his boot that knocked the tall man off balance. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a sudden gust of wind through dry leaves. A few heads turned sharply. A woman in the second row covered her mouth in shock. Someone whispered, "Did you see that?" Briggs looked down at Marcus with a crooked half-smile that carried more contempt than authority. "Sit down before you cause problems," he muttered loudly enough for several people to hear. The message wasn't about order. It was about humiliation. Marcus steadied himself slowly, one hand brushing the edge of a nearby bench as he regained his balance. He didn't shout. He didn't react with anger. Instead, he straightened his jacket with deliberate calm, the kind of composed movement that seemed completely out of place after what had just happened. That quiet reaction confused people more than the shove itself. Briggs frowned slightly, as if disappointed that the moment hadn't turned into a louder scene. Marcus lifted his eyes and met the officer's stare directly. There was no fear there, no panic, just a steady, almost unsettling calm that made the officer shift his weight. The entire courtroom had grown strangely silent now, the earlier whispers replaced by a tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Somewhere near the judge's bench, a clerk paused mid-sentence while organizing papers. A bailiff looked uncertainly toward the hallway. Marcus spoke then, his voice low and even, the words carrying just far enough for the officer to hear clearly. "You should stop now." Briggs let out a short laugh, shaking his head with amused disbelief. "Stop?" he repeated under his breath. "You walked into the wrong courtroom, buddy." What the officer didn't realize, what no one in that room realized yet, was that the man standing calmly in front of him was not just another witness. Marcus Hale had spent 14 years serving in one of the most disciplined military units in the world. He had operated in deserts, oceans, and places most people would never hear about. He had faced pressure that could break ordinary people long before sunrise. And at that exact moment, as the quiet tension tightened inside the Richmond courthouse, something far bigger than a simple courtroom incident had just begun. The silence that followed felt heavier than the shove itself. For a moment, the entire courtroom seemed to pause as if the air had thickened. Officer Daniel Briggs remained standing in front of Marcus Hale with the relaxed posture of someone who believed the situation was already settled. To him it had been a simple correction, the kind of casual authority he used every day. To everyone else in the room, it looked different. The murmur that slowly began to spread among the spectators carried confusion more than anger. People leaned toward one another, whispering quietly while pretending not to stare. Marcus stood still where he was, one hand resting lightly against the back of the wooden bench beside him. The polished surface felt cool under his palm. He took a slow breath and allowed his shoulders to relax again. Anyone watching closely might have noticed that his calm was not forced. It was practiced. It was the kind of composure that came from years of discipline. Years of learning that reacting too quickly could turn a small moment into something much larger. Briggs studied him with growing irritation. The officer had expected a protest or at least a raised voice. Instead, he was met with silence and steady eye contact. That calm unsettled him in ways he could not immediately explain. "Do not test my patience," Briggs said with a sharp edge in his voice. "The courtroom rules apply to everyone who walks in here." Marcus answered without raising his tone. "I understand the rules. I came to follow them." The exchange drew the attention of Judge Howard Keller, who had just entered through the side door behind the bench. The judge paused while adjusting his robe and glanced across the room at the unusual stillness. His expression was the practiced neutrality of someone who had spent decades inside courtrooms. "What is the delay this morning?" he asked while settling into his chair. The bailiff hesitated before responding. "Just a small misunderstanding, Your Honor." Officer Briggs stepped back half a step, but did not move away from Marcus entirely. He pointed toward the benches with a short motion of his hand. "Sit down and stay there until you are called." Marcus nodded once and took a seat near the aisle. The wooden bench creaked softly under his weight. Around him the tension began to loosen just enough for people to resume quiet conversation. A young attorney 2 rows ahead turned slightly to glance at him, curiosity written clearly across her face before she quickly looked away. Briggs remained standing in the aisle, arms folded across his chest. Something about the encounter continued to bother him. It was not the man's words. It was the way he carried himself. Marcus Hale did not look like someone who had just been intimidated. He looked like someone who had simply chosen not to respond yet. The judge began reviewing the morning docket while clerks organized paperwork on the long table beside the bench. Outside the tall courthouse windows, a delivery truck rumbled down the street, and sunlight shifted across the polished floor. The ordinary rhythm of the courtroom slowly returned. Yet beneath that routine, a quiet tension remained. Marcus opened the slim folder he had brought and reviewed the documents inside. His movements were precise and unhurried. Inside the folder were statements he had prepared carefully the night before. Names, dates, observations that he intended to present clearly when his time came to speak. None of it involved the officer who had just confronted him. At least not directly. Across the room, Briggs leaned closer to another officer and spoke quietly. "Something about that guy does not sit right with me." The second officer shrugged and glanced toward Marcus. "He looks calm enough." Briggs exhaled through his nose and shook his head. Calm can mean a lot of things. At that same moment, several floors above the courtroom, a security technician inside the courthouse monitoring office paused while watching the building's camera feeds. One particular screen showed the courtroom where Marcus had just taken his seat. The technician leaned closer to the monitor and picked up the desk phone beside him. "I think you should take a look at camera 4, he said quietly when the line connected. The voice on the other end asked one simple question. "Is that him?" The technician kept his eyes on the screen where Marcus sat quietly reviewing his documents. "Yes," the technician replied after a brief pause. "That is definitely him." The quiet hum of the courtroom slowly returned, but the tension never truly disappeared. Marcus Hale remained seated near the aisle, the slim folder resting on his lap as his eyes moved calmly across the documents inside. From a distance, he looked like any other witness waiting for his name to be called. Yet there was something different about the stillness in his posture. It was the kind of stillness that came from experience rather than patience. Years earlier, Marcus had learned that the loudest rooms often revealed the least important details, while the quiet ones exposed everything that mattered. The courthouse clock on the wall ticked steadily toward 9:15 in the morning. Each second echoed faintly against the marble walls and polished wooden benches. Judge Howard Keller adjusted the stack of case files in front of him while clerks prepared the first hearing of the day. A low murmur filled the room again as attorneys leaned together to discuss last-minute notes. From the outside, the scene looked routine, the kind of ordinary morning that unfolded in courthouses across the country every single day. Yet across the aisle, Officer Daniel Briggs continued to glance toward Marcus with a growing sense of irritation that he could not quite explain. The officer had expected the man to shrink into his seat after the confrontation earlier. Instead, Marcus appeared almost completely unaffected. He read through his papers carefully, occasionally turning a page with deliberate precision. That calm behavior felt almost like a quiet challenge. Briggs shifted his weight and leaned toward the second officer standing beside him. "Something about that man is not right," he muttered under his breath. The second officer glanced over briefly before returning his attention to the front of the room. "He looks like a witness waiting his turn. That is all." Briggs folded his arms across his chest again, but did not answer. His eyes narrowed slightly as he studied Marcus more closely. Meanwhile, several floors above the courtroom, the courthouse security monitoring office had grown unusually quiet. The technician who had noticed the camera feed moments earlier now stood beside a desk, where multiple monitors displayed different angles of the building. On one screen, the courtroom scene played out in real time. The technician kept his eyes on Marcus Hale as he spoke softly into the phone still pressed to his ear. "He just sat down a few minutes ago," the technician explained. There was a brief pause on the line before the voice on the other end responded with careful interest. "Are you certain about the identification?" The technician zoomed the camera feed slightly and studied the image again. The man in the charcoal suit sat with perfect posture, his expression calm, while reading through a thin stack of papers. "Yes," the technician said quietly. "I am certain." There was another pause on the line, longer this time. When the voice returned, it carried a tone of controlled urgency. "Stay on that camera. Do not lose sight of him." Back inside the courtroom, Marcus turned another page in his folder and briefly lifted his gaze toward the judge's bench. The hearing had not yet begun, but the attorneys near the front were already organizing their arguments. Somewhere near the back row, a man coughed softly while shifting in his seat. Outside the tall courthouse windows, the city of Richmond continued its ordinary morning rhythm as cars passed slowly along the street, and a delivery driver pushed a hand truck across the sidewalk. Marcus closed the folder for a moment and rested both hands calmly on top of it. His thoughts drifted briefly to the reason he had come here that morning. The request had seemed simple enough when it arrived 2 days earlier. A phone call from an attorney asking if he would be willing to testify about something he had witnessed weeks before. Marcus had agreed without hesitation because telling the truth rarely felt complicated. Yet as he sat in that courtroom, now, he could sense the quiet currents moving beneath the surface of the room. People sometimes believed courtrooms were places where power was displayed openly. In reality, the most important decisions often happened before anyone spoke a single word. Across the aisle, Briggs was still watching him, his expression growing more impatient with every passing minute. Marcus noticed the stare but did not react. Instead, he lifted the folder again and opened it to the final page. At the bottom of the document was a name written clearly in black ink, the same name that had drawn attention to this hearing in the first place. Marcus studied the page for a moment before closing the folder again. Whatever happened next inside this courtroom would not remain a small misunderstanding for very long. The quiet anticipation inside the Richmond courthouse slowly sharpened into something heavier as the morning clock reached 9:20. Judge Howard Keller leaned forward slightly and adjusted the microphone on the bench while the clerk prepared to call the first case. Papers slid across the long wooden table with the soft whisper of official routine. Yet beneath that routine, a subtle tension continued to stretch across the room, like a thread pulled too tight. Marcus Hale sat exactly where he had been minutes earlier, his posture straight, the slim folder resting calmly between his hands. From the outside, nothing about him seemed unusual. He looked like a man waiting his turn to speak. Yet to anyone paying close attention, there was a quiet awareness in his eyes that suggested he was observing far more than the courtroom proceedings. Across the aisle, Officer Daniel Briggs remained standing with the stubborn confidence of someone used to being the authority in every room he entered. The officer glanced once again toward Marcus, irritation lingering in his expression. The calm response from earlier still bothered him more than he cared to admit. People who had nothing to hide usually reacted loudly when confronted. This man had done the opposite. Briggs leaned slightly toward the second officer beside him again. "I do not like the way he keeps watching everything," Briggs muttered quietly. The other officer shrugged with mild impatience. "Maybe he is simply paying attention to where he is. It is a courthouse. People do that here." Briggs exhaled slowly but did not respond. His gaze drifted back toward Marcus just as the courtroom clerk finally stood and spoke clearly into the microphone. The court is now in session. Please rise. The sound of wooden benches shifting echoed softly as everyone in the room stood at the same time. Marcus rose smoothly with the others, his movement measured and composed. Judge Keller looked across the courtroom with practiced authority before taking his seat again. Thank you. Please be seated. The room settled once more, the quiet shuffling fading into stillness. The clerk began reading the case number scheduled for the morning hearing, her voice steady and professional. As the details unfolded, a few people near the front of the courtroom exchanged curious glances. The case had already attracted unusual attention over the past week. Several local reporters had even requested transcripts earlier that morning. Marcus listened carefully as the clerk spoke, his expression unchanged. The name mentioned in the report was the same one he had studied only minutes earlier inside his folder. That name had a way of drawing interest from people who normally stayed far away from public hearings. Somewhere near the back row a man quietly adjusted a small notebook while pretending to review legal notes. In reality, he was listening to every word with careful focus. Across the aisle, Briggs shifted his stance again, tapping his fingers lightly against the side of his duty belt in an impatient rhythm. His attention remained fixed on Marcus as though waiting for the man to make the smallest mistake. The judge looked down at the file in front of him and cleared his throat. The witness listed in this report should be present in the courtroom this morning, he said calmly. The clerk scanned the room briefly before calling the name aloud. Marcus Hale. For the first time since the hearing began, several heads turned in the direction of the tall man seated near the aisle. Marcus rose again without hesitation and stepped forward into the open space between the benches. His footsteps were steady and unhurried as he walked toward the witness stand. The polished floor reflected the faint glow of sunlight coming through the courthouse windows, casting long pale lines beneath his shoes. Briggs watched the movement carefully, his expression tightening slightly as Marcus passed within a few feet of him. Something about the man's quiet confidence continued to feel unsettling. Marcus reached the witness stand and paused beside the chair while the clerk prepared the oath. The courtroom fell almost completely silent again as every eye turned toward the front of the room. Several floors above, inside the courthouse monitoring office, the technician who had been watching the camera feed leaned closer to the screen. The image clearly showed Marcus standing at the witness stand. The technician picked up the phone again and spoke quietly into the receiver. He just stepped forward. There was a brief pause before the voice on the other end replied with measured calm. Good. Keep watching. Everything is about to begin. The courtroom held its breath as Marcus Hale placed his right hand gently on the wooden rail beside the witness stand. The clerk stood in front of him with a small card, her voice calm and practiced as she prepared to administer the oath. The overhead lights reflected softly across the polished surfaces of the courtroom, creating a quiet glow that contrasted with the growing tension in the room. Marcus lifted his hand as instructed, his posture steady, his expression composed. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? The clerk asked clearly. I do, Marcus replied in a calm voice that carried easily across the silent courtroom. The clerk nodded once and stepped aside while Marcus took his seat at the witness stand. From where he sat, he could see nearly everyone in the room. The judge directly ahead of him. The attorneys gathered at the long table to his left. The small group of spectators seated quietly behind the rail. And standing near the aisle, still watching him closely, Officer Daniel Briggs. Judge Howard Keller adjusted the papers in front of him before speaking. Mr. Hale, you have been called here as a witness regarding the report submitted 2 weeks ago. Please answer the questions clearly and directly. Marcus nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. The prosecutor rose from the table and approached the center of the room with a thin folder in hand. Her name was Linda Warren, a woman known for her careful attention to detail and her calm but persistent questioning. She placed the folder on the podium and glanced briefly at Marcus before beginning. Mr. Hale, could you please state your full name for the record? Marcus leaned slightly toward the microphone. Marcus Daniel Hale. And your occupation, Mr. Hale? Marcus paused for only a moment before answering. I currently work as a security consultant. A faint murmur passed through the spectators before fading again. Warren nodded and turned a page in her folder. You submitted a written statement regarding an incident that took place outside a municipal building in Richmond on the evening of May 12th, correct? That is correct, Marcus answered. Could you explain to the court what you observed that evening? Marcus rested his hands lightly on the edge of the witness stand as he spoke. I was leaving the building after attending a meeting when I noticed a situation developing near the entrance. A few individuals appeared to be involved in a disagreement that was attracting attention. I remained nearby because I believed the situation might require someone to provide an accurate account later. The prosecutor listened carefully before asking her next question. And during this time, you witnessed actions that you believed were important enough to report. Yes, Marcus replied calmly. Several things occurred that suggested the situation was not being handled in a professional manner. Across the courtroom, Officer Briggs shifted his stance again. Something about the testimony made him increasingly uncomfortable. He leaned slightly toward the second officer beside him and whispered under his breath. What exactly did he see that night? The second officer shrugged slightly without answering. At the witness stand, Marcus continued speaking with measured clarity. I documented what I observed because I believe that accountability matters in any profession that involves public trust. The prosecutor nodded thoughtfully. And you included the names of certain individuals in your report, correct? Yes, Marcus said. The names were listed based on what I witnessed and what could be verified through the available records. Warren glanced down at the document in her folder and then looked back toward Marcus. One of the names included in that report belongs to an officer currently assigned to courthouse duty. At that moment, several people in the courtroom shifted slightly in their seats. Marcus remained calm, his voice steady. That is correct. Warren closed the folder slowly and spoke with deliberate clarity. For the record, Mr. Hale, please confirm the name of the officer referenced in your statement. Marcus turned his gaze briefly toward the aisle where Officer Briggs stood watching him. Then he returned his attention to the front of the courtroom and answered calmly. Officer Daniel Briggs. The room fell silent again. Even the faint sounds from the hallway outside seemed to disappear for a moment. Across the aisle, Briggs stiffened slightly, his eyes narrowing as the realization settled in that the quiet man he had confronted earlier was now speaking about him in front of the entire court. The silence that followed Marcus Hale's statement spread slowly through the Richmond courtroom like a ripple across still water. For a moment no one spoke. Even the faint rustling of papers stopped as the weight of the name he had just said settled over the room. Officer Daniel Briggs remained standing near the aisle exactly where he had been earlier, but the relaxed confidence he carried before had begun to fade. His shoulders stiffened slightly, and his jaw tightened as dozens of eyes quietly turned toward him. Judge Howard Keller leaned forward a few inches behind the bench, studying the courtroom with careful attention before shifting his gaze back to the witness stand. The judge had presided over hundreds of hearings during his career, yet something about the stillness in the room told him this moment deserved closer observation. Prosecutor Linda Warren allowed the silence to linger for several seconds before continuing. Mr. Hale, she said calmly, you mentioned that your written report included details that could be verified through available records. Could you clarify what you meant by that statement? Marcus rested his hands lightly on the edge of the witness stand again. His voice remained calm and steady. The area outside the building where the incident occurred is covered by several security cameras. The footage from those cameras provides a clear timeline of what happened that evening. Warren nodded slightly. And you personally reviewed that footage? Yes, Marcus answered. The recording confirmed the observations I documented in my report. A quiet murmur passed through the spectators again before fading into silence. Warren opened her folder once more and removed a printed document. For the sake of clarity, she continued, the report you submitted also included timestamps from that footage and a description of the individuals present. That is correct, Marcus replied. Warren looked down briefly at the document before asking the next question with deliberate care. And the officer you identified in your report, the same officer you named a moment ago, was present during that entire sequence of events. Yes, Marcus said calmly. Across the aisle, Briggs shifted his weight again and glanced toward the second officer beside him. The look on his face carried a mixture of irritation and uncertainty. He had not expected the quiet witness from earlier to become the focus of the hearing. Meanwhile, Marcus remained composed at the witness stand, his posture unchanged as the questioning continued. Warren closed the folder gently and stepped slightly closer to the podium microphone. Mr. Hale, you stated earlier that accountability is important in professions that involve public trust. Could you explain why you felt it was necessary to come forward personally instead of leaving the matter to internal reports? Marcus paused briefly before answering. Because sometimes internal reports do not tell the entire story. The courtroom grew even quieter after that response. Warren tilted her head slightly with interest. And you believed your testimony might help clarify that story? Yes, Marcus said simply. Warren nodded once and turned her attention briefly toward the judge before speaking again. Your Honor, the witness also submitted supporting material along with his written statement. The materials were provided to the court earlier this morning for review. Judge Keller glanced toward the clerk beside him, who handed over a thin evidence folder. The judge opened it slowly and scanned the first page. The room remained silent as he reviewed the document. Finally, he looked up again toward the witness stand. Mr. Hale, the materials included here appear to reference additional documentation that has not yet been presented in this hearing. Marcus met the judge's gaze calmly. That documentation exists, Your Honor. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair. And where is that documentation currently located? Marcus answered without hesitation. In the possession of investigators who requested that I appear here today. Several heads turned toward the courtroom in trance at those words, as if expecting something to happen at that very moment. Even Officer Briggs glanced briefly toward the door before returning his eyes to Marcus. The tension that had been quietly building since the hearing began now filled the room completely. Marcus remained seated at the witness stand, calm and steady, as if he had already expected exactly what would happen next. For several seconds after Marcus Hale finished speaking, the courtroom remained completely still. The tension that had slowly built throughout the morning now filled every corner of the room, like a silent storm waiting to break. Judge Howard Keller kept his eyes on the witness stand, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of the evidence folder that had just been handed to him. Across the aisle, Officer Daniel Briggs stood rigid, his earlier confidence replaced by a tight stillness that was difficult to hide. The spectators behind the rail exchanged quiet glances, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Then the sound came. The courtroom door opened slowly at the back of the room. It was not a dramatic entrance. There was no shouting, no sudden movement. Just the steady sound of footsteps crossing the polished floor. 3 individuals entered the courtroom wearing dark suits instead of uniforms. Their posture carried the calm authority of people who were accustomed to being taken seriously without raising their voices. The first man approached the center aisle and paused briefly as his eyes moved toward the witness stand where Marcus sat. For a moment, the 2 men simply looked at each other. Marcus gave a small nod of recognition. The man returned the nod before turning toward the judge's bench. Your Honor, he said respectfully, I apologize for the interruption. Judge Keller leaned forward slightly. And you are? The man reached into his jacket and presented a small identification folder. Special Agent Michael Carter, Naval Criminal Investigative Service. The words landed in the room with quiet weight. Several spectators straightened in their seats. The second and third individuals who had entered the courtroom remained near the doorway, their presence calm, but unmistakably official. Carter continued speaking with measured clarity. We are here in connection with documentation referenced by the witness currently on the stand. The materials were submitted through proper channels earlier this morning. Judge Keller glanced down at the evidence folder again before returning his attention to the agent. The witness indicated that investigators requested his presence today. Carter nodded once. That is correct, Your Honor. Marcus Hale was asked to testify because his statement provided a clear timeline connected to a larger review currently underway. Across the aisle, Officer Briggs felt the weight of several eyes turning toward him again. His expression hardened slightly as he tried to maintain the appearance of control. Meanwhile, Marcus remained seated calmly at the witness stand, watching the exchange with the same steady composure he had carried all morning. Carter stepped closer to the front of the courtroom and placed a sealed envelope on the clerk's desk. Inside this envelope are certified copies of the documentation referenced by Mr. Hale's report, Carter explained. The materials include verified footage records, timestamp analysis, and departmental communication logs that relate directly to the incident under review. The clerk accepted the envelope and handed it carefully to the judge. Judge Keller opened the seal slowly and reviewed the first page. As his eyes moved across the document, his expression changed in a way that did not go unnoticed by anyone watching. He turned the page, then another, reading in silence while the courtroom waited. Finally, the judge looked up again, his gaze moving briefly toward Officer Briggs before returning to the agent standing before him. Special Agent Carter, the judge said carefully, these materials appear to confirm that the witness's statement is supported by independent documentation. Carter nodded calmly. Yes, Your Honor. That is why we asked Mr. Hale to appear here today. The judge closed the folder slowly and rested his hands on top of it. Across the room, Marcus remained calm, his posture unchanged. For the first time that morning, it was no longer just a witness speaking. The quiet man who had walked into the courtroom earlier was now clearly connected to something far larger than anyone had realized. And the hearing that had begun, as a routine testimony, was suddenly becoming something very different. The atmosphere inside the Richmond courthouse shifted the moment Judge Howard Keller finished reviewing the documents placed before him. The quiet that followed was no longer the calm silence of routine proceedings. It was the kind of silence that appears when everyone in a room realizes the situation has changed in a way they did not expect. The judge closed the folder carefully and rested both hands on the polished wood of the bench, his eyes moving slowly across the courtroom before returning to Special Agent Michael Carter. The materials provided here indicate that the incident referenced by the witness is part of a broader review, the judge said with measured clarity. Carter nodded once. That is correct, Your Honor. The documentation confirms that the events described in Mr. Hale's statement align with evidence collected during an ongoing investigation regarding professional conduct and procedural integrity. The words were chosen carefully, but their meaning was unmistakable. Several spectators in the back rows leaned slightly forward, listening with renewed attention. Across the aisle, Officer Daniel Briggs stood motionless, though the tension in his posture had grown obvious. His arms were no longer folded across his chest. Instead, his hands rested stiffly at his sides as he watched the exchange unfold in front of him. Meanwhile, Marcus Hale remained seated at the witness stand, calm and composed. His hands rested lightly on the wooden rail as he observed the moment without expression. The same quiet focus he had carried since entering the courthouse earlier that morning had not changed. Prosecutor Linda Warren stepped forward again and glanced toward the judge. Your Honor, with the court's permission, the prosecution would like the investigative materials to be entered into the record for preliminary review. Judge Keller nodded slowly. The request is granted. The clerk accepted the documents from the bench and began marking them for record entry. The soft sound of paper being organized echoed through the courtroom. Carter spoke again, his tone respectful but firm. Your Honor, the review conducted by our office included an examination of several reports filed over the past year. Those reports involved multiple incidents that raised questions about procedural standards during public interactions. The judge raised an eyebrow slightly. And those reports relate to the officer named during this testimony. Carter answered calmly. Yes, Your Honor. The witness statement provided this morning offered a clear timeline that helped confirm several details that had previously remained incomplete. A quiet wave of murmurs passed through the spectators before fading again. Briggs shifted his stance slightly, his gaze moving from the witness stand to the investigators near the doorway, and then back again. For the first time that morning, the confident authority he carried earlier seemed noticeably diminished. The judge looked toward the officer briefly before returning his attention to Marcus. Mr. Hale, Judge Keller said carefully, your statement and supporting materials appear to have played a significant role in clarifying this situation. Marcus inclined his head slightly. I provided the information because it was the accurate account of what I observed. The judge studied him for a moment before speaking again. The court appreciates witnesses who take their responsibility seriously. Across the courtroom, the air seemed to grow heavier as the significance of the moment settled over everyone present. The quiet man who had entered the courthouse earlier that morning had not raised his voice or demanded attention. Yet his testimony had shifted the direction of the entire hearing. Special Agent Carter stepped back slightly from the center aisle, allowing the focus to return to the bench. Judge Keller closed the evidence folder once more and placed it neatly beside the case file. Based on the documentation presented, the court will suspend further testimony in this hearing until the investigative review is completed and the relevant findings are formally submitted. The gavel struck the bench once, the sound echoing softly across the room. The hearing that had begun as a routine proceeding was now clearly part of something much larger. Marcus remained seated for a moment longer before rising slowly from the witness stand. As he stepped down and walked back toward the aisle, the same calm composure remained in his expression. The difference now was that the entire courtroom understood that the quiet witness they had watched all morning had not been just another observer. He had been the person who brought the truth into the room. The sound of the gavel faded slowly through the Richmond courtroom, leaving behind a silence that felt very different from the quiet that had filled the room earlier that morning. People did not rush to stand or gather their belongings. Instead, many of them remained seated for a few seconds longer, absorbing what had just taken place. The hearing had ended, but the weight of the moment lingered in the air like the final note of a long echo. Marcus Hale stepped away from the witness stand and walked calmly back toward the aisle where he had been seated earlier. His pace was steady and unhurried, the same composed rhythm he had carried since the moment he first entered the courthouse that morning. The polished floor reflected the soft morning light from the tall windows as he moved past the rows of benches. Behind him, attorneys quietly gathered their folders while the clerk organized the documents that had just been entered into the record. Judge Howard Keller remained seated for a moment longer before standing and exiting through the side door behind the bench, his expression thoughtful as he carried the evidence folder with him. Near the back of the room, several spectators exchanged quiet remarks about what they had witnessed. What had started as an ordinary court session had turned into something far more significant. Across the aisle, Officer Daniel Briggs remained standing exactly where he had been during the testimony. The difference now was unmistakable. Earlier that morning, he had carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who believed his authority would never be questioned. Now that confidence had faded into a rigid stillness. Briggs watched Marcus as the tall man approached the aisle, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for some explanation that would restore the certainty he had felt before. Marcus paused briefly beside the bench where his folder still rested. He picked it up and closed it carefully before turning toward the exit. As he did, his gaze met Briggs for a brief moment. Neither man spoke. There was no anger in Marcus's expression and no triumph either. Only the calm steadiness that had been there from the beginning. For Briggs, the silence felt heavier than any accusation that had been spoken in the courtroom. A few feet away, Special Agent Michael Carter stood near the center aisle speaking quietly with the second investigator who had entered earlier. When Marcus approached, Carter gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you for appearing today, Mr. Hale," Carter said in a low voice. "Your statement clarified several details that were important to the review." Marcus answered calmly. "I simply provided the truth as I saw it." Carter studied him for a moment before responding. "Sometimes that is exactly what is needed." Marcus inclined his head slightly and continued walking toward the courtroom doors. As he reached the exit, he paused briefly and looked back across the room one final time. The courthouse looked the same as it had when he entered earlier that morning. The wooden benches were still lined in quiet rows. The tall windows still allowed sunlight to spill across the polished floor. Yet the atmosphere had changed. The truth had a way of doing that. It did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it entered a room quietly and waited until the right moment to be heard. Marcus stepped into the hallway beyond the courtroom where the sounds of the building returned to their normal rhythm. Footsteps echoed faintly along the corridor as attorneys moved between offices and distant voices carried through the open doors of other courtrooms. For Marcus, the morning was already finished. The responsibility he had accepted when he agreed to testify had been fulfilled. Behind him, the door to the courtroom closed softly. Inside, the conversation about the hearing would continue long after he was gone. But Marcus did not look back again, because the lesson of the morning had already been made clear. Authority may command attention for a moment, but integrity has a way of outlasting everything else.